About the last 5 years, I haven't been really working on what we would call the assassination. What I've been working on is excavating Kennedy's foreign policy everywhere except Vietnam and Cuba. All right? And one of the reasons I've done this is because although every JFK book says, Kennedy let the Bay of Pigs fail, Kennedy would not send combat troops into Vietnam, Kennedy would not bomb the missile silos during the missile crisis, nobody explains why he didn't do that. Okay, so this is something that really puzzled me, because we know, for example, that Nixon told him, well, declare a beachhead and invade. Okay, and we also know that Johnson and Eisenhower went all the way in Vietnam. At one point, Eisenhower even approved, go ahead and use atomic weapons. All right, but he didn't do any of those things, and so this has always puzzled me. And so I thought, well, maybe we're looking at the telescope at the wrong end. Maybe we should put Vietnam and Cuba in the background. Okay, and put all the other stuff in the foreground, and maybe we'll see a different gestalt picture. That Vietnam and Cuba really weren't different than the other things that JFK was doing, but we've been obsessed with it for, I won't get into why and how, but and so this is what I decided to do. Looking at the constellation from the other end. And the other reason I decided to do this is I wanted to find out how come the United States today has, such an absolutely screwed up foreign policy, that nobody seems to understand, or can explain. And so it has a kind of historical context to it. All right. So these are what we call the good old days. All right. So how do we get to this, with very little to choose from between the Democratic Party and, it's sort of like pick your poison. Okay. For me, I just voted for Jill Stein, all right? So we're going to try and find out how we ended up with this Hobson's choice. So I'm going to try and demonstrate that Kennedy's foreign policy was not reformist, but it was actually revolutionary. And when he was killed, that policy died very shortly afterwards. But to understand that, you have to understand how this all started. And one of the points I want to make right off the bat, this was not a willy-nilly thing. This was not a haphazard choices. This was a very planned revisionist foreign policy, okay? All right, on the eve of the Democratic Convention in 1960, Kennedy tells Harris Woolford, we have to win. Because if it's Johnson or Symington, it's just going to be more of Dulles Atchison, okay? The same Cold War foreign policy stuff all over again. All right, George Ball was one of the smartest guys in Kennedy's State Department. He actually called it the Kennedy Doctrine. See, what we were trying to do was challenge the status quo in the Third World. And by doing that, we would counter the Soviets, since we were also now on the side of revolutionary nationalism. Okay, so it's an idealist thing, but it's also a practical kind of thing. All right, take the ball away from them. All right. All right, so what was Kennedy rebelling against? There really wasn't a huge foreign policy apparatus in the United States until the 20th century, because there really wasn't a lot of intervention the United States did. We want to buying Alaska, you really don't need a big State Department for that. All right, okay, so what happens is that after World War I, okay, the United States really begins to develop a huge foreign policy establishment. And all you have to know is that it was centered here in New York, and Mr. Pratt donated the building, and he was a director of Standard Oil. So right at the beginning, the power elite is going to influence the State Department. All right? Okay, the Council on Foreign Relations was founded in 1921, and very early, within about 5 or 6 years, these guys are planning, we're going to take away the lead from London. Okay, we're going to be the leaders of the Western foreign policy apparatus, not those guys in England anymore. All right, and this is really interesting. Okay, one of its first directors was this guy named Paul Cravath of Cravath, Swain and Moore, which is John McCloy's law firm. And we're going to learn a lot about John McCloy, okay, during this presentation. You know, I don't think he's been explored enough just how bad this guy really was. All right. Cravath, of course, did not have a lot of interest or know a lot about foreign policy, all right? And he didn't really have an interest in understanding the third world or the evolving world. And this is something that Kennedy is going to be very specific about in the 1950s. He was going to say that, you know, we don't spend enough time understanding the people in those areas. Okay, we spend too much time totoing up to the power elite in those places instead of developing relations with the people who live there. All right, the CFR sets up a web of influence between New York and Washington, and the goal is to create a single world-spanning political economy with the United States at its center. And this would become David Rockefeller's lifelong aim, which was achieved under that great Democratic president, Bill Clinton. Okay, he finally gets NAFTA through. All right, and he died a few years later. And me and Peter were at his daughter's conference, right, at Harvard. She's the black sheep of the family, Abby Rockefeller. Yeah. All right, an accompanying goal was to educate American opinion leaders in order to gain popular support for their aims and ends. So therefore you had local chapters of the CFR group all over the United States, in all the major cities. All right, how influential were they? Of the 8-man board that advised Truman to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, 5 were members of the CFR. Before Eisenhower was going to run for president, he was president in Colombia, and he went ahead and he joined the CFR study groups, and he became an editorial advisor to their magazine, Foreign Affairs. Henry Kissinger began his career as a research editor for a CFR study group, and they published his first best-selling book, Nuclear Weapons, and we're going to learn a lot about Henry Kissinger.
By Nelson Rockefeller.
Yeah, we're going to learn a lot about Mr. Kissinger. How this guy ever won a Nobel Peace Prize is just mind-boggling when you think about it. All right.
Obama won one.
What?
Obama won one.
Well, he's not quite as bad as this guy, though. All right. From 47 to 52, 66% of the State Department was from the CFR. CIA directors Dulles, McCone, Helms, Colby, and Bush were all former CFR members. Half the members in 65 were big business leaders. And during World War II, a whole committee of the CFR was incorporated in the State Department. Some of their policies, they predicted the British Empire would collapse and the United States would take over. All right? They predicted a world economy to be controlled by the IMF and the World Bank 5 years before it happened. Okay, right here, they begin the new Cold War. We're going to go soft on Germany, but we don't want to help the USSR. All right? And this is incredible. This lasted for 25 years. Keep a low profile in South Africa. All right, but we still want a business, but we don't want to raise a lot of trouble. All right, very keen on Southeast Asia. All right, war with Japan is possible over Indochina. That's in 1940. The loss of any further portion of the Far East would have this. So this is really a domino theory, right here, 1958. Okay, we can't lose any part of Indochina. All right.
Southeast Asia.
All right. And then here's John McCloy begins to enter the picture here. CFR creates a public committee to support Johnson's Vietnam policies. The chairman of that group is John McCloy. All right. The group says that Johnson acted rightly and in the national interest in committing American troops to Vietnam. All right. McCloy and David Rockefeller meet with LBJ in open support of this escalation policy. In other words, within 1 year of the issuance of the Warren Report, McCloy is on board with a reversal of JFK's Vietnam policy. And this will only be one of more, okay? This one is really, I didn't know anything about this. I'm sure everybody, well, most people here remember Roger Feynman, right? Okay, he was a lawyer and he did a lot of work on the medical evidence. But he had worked at CBS for several years, okay, in the mid-70s. And unfortunately, he passed away. But he left behind a manuscript, which I adapted into an article for Consortium News called How CBS Aided the JFK Cover-Up. And he went into remarkable detail. And I think since he's passed away, he actually stole these documents out of the CBS because he knew he was going to get fired because he kept on writing letters to the executives there. You know, what we're doing is wrong here. This is so unfair. You know, we shouldn't. So he knew the writing was on the wall. So before he left, he would stay after in the CBS building, you know, and go ahead and ruffle through the files and steal stuff. A big turning point in that 1960s, everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? The 4-part CBS, 1 hour a night in 19s with Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite. All right, that did not begin as it ended. The guys there, the lower level guys, really wanted to do a real investigation, and they actually talked about putting the Warren Commission on trial. And we're not going to do what that stupid FBI did. We're going to do real experiments. Okay, well, this was crushed, and the key moment came when they sent 2 of the reporters to Stanford. You know, I'm not going to guilt by association, Gary. All right, and they met this guy named Bayless Manning, dean of the Stanford Law School. Salant sent them out there. All right, Manning says such a program would not be in the national interest since it had political implications. His advice was taken, and CBS did a hatchet job on the critics. Well, what I didn't know was this. He created this new position at the CFR. There had not been a president before, and Bayless Manning becomes the first guy. All right, coincidence or conspiracy? You make up your mind. All right. Okay. JFK was not Eastern establishment. This is a terrible mistake made by a lot of people, all right? Okay, he never joined the CFR, all right? He never joined any secret societies, all right? He didn't like working intelligence in World War II, and he got out of that, and he got into the South Pacific, you know, with those Joe Sixpack guys and those suicide missions, all right? All right, here's another point. To show how much he was not part of this club, consider Jock Whitney. Jock Whitney had been the ambassador to England under Eisenhower. All right, firmly in bed with the CFR group and the whole Eastern establishment. All right, when Kennedy becomes president, all right, very terse termination telegram. All right. Okay, but the last laugh, Jock Whitney got the last laugh. All right, because the night of the assassination, Whitney goes in to the New York Herald Tribune they needed a copy editor. Here's this guy worth $700 million, and he has to work as a copy editor. All right, and there's the first newspaper to come out with the Oswald as sociopath fairy tale. All right, these guys always win. All right, now here's some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking. Well, this book is the book that really kind of altered my calculus about who Kennedy was and what his foreign policy was. You know, and I read it in about 2 nights, staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning. And it also convinced me that there's an industry out there, the latest member being Robert Dallek, okay, to cover up what Kennedy's foreign policy actually was, all right? This book is a very good book on Kennedy's African foreign policy, all right, excluding Congo. Mahoney concentrates on the Congo, all right? And in my opinion, this is the best book on Kennedy's overall foreign policy. And this is the most recent one. And Gary, he's at Stanford, all right? Robert Rakove, okay, so get a dinner date with him, all right? All right, Kennedy, Johnson, and the non-aligned world. All right, and I guess Peter has some reservations about this last book. Okay, Greg Polgrain's The Incubus of Intervention, which concentrates on Indonesia. All right, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay. All right, so I would recommend, if you want to read one, read the Rakove book, but there's no problem with reading all of
R-A-K-O.
Rakove.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, now, and this is a little, I talked about this earlier today. I'm a little bit, although I admire Jim Douglas and I love his book, and I gave him like a 15-page rave review and everything, and he thinks I helped him sell 100,000 copies of that book. I go, Jim, when Oliver Stone got on Bill Maher and brought your book in front of his face, that's how you sold 100,000 copies. It wasn't me, okay? But he probably read your review. I go, well, I don't know that, All right, now, the first chapter of his book is called "The Cold War Returns." I don't really agree with that, okay? Because I'm going to argue here that Kennedy's foreign policy was already formed by the time he walked into the White House. All right, and we have a really important person coming up here whose name was never mentioned until Jim Douglas's book in 2008, which means nobody heard of this guy for 44 years. All right. But I would argue that he was probably the single most important influence on Kennedy's foreign policy. All right, and we happen to have a relative of Edmund Gullion on board here, a guy named Bill Simpich, is related to the late Edmund Gullion. All right, and he actually got me to pronounce the guy's name right, because I used to pronounce it Gullion, and he says, "No, Jim, it's Gullion. He's my uncle." He was all right, all right. Gullion spoke fluent French, so he was transferred to Vietnam out of the State Department. And Kennedy knew him briefly in Washington, all right, because he went over to the state. He needed some advice on a speech he was giving. He met him there, but then he was transferred to Vietnam, all right, and on a visit to Saigon in 1951, young Congressman Kennedy, I think he's 34 years old at this time, goes to Saigon, and he meets up with Gullion again, all right. All right, at this meeting, which is at a rooftop restaurant in Saigon, Kennedy asks Gullion, "Is France going to win the war?" And it's Gullion, "Nope, France was never going to win the war in Vietnam." All right, Ho Chi Minh had inspired the Viet Minh to such an extent that they would rather die than go back under the yoke of colonialism. All right, France could never win a war of attrition because the French home front would never support it. Now, doesn't that sound exactly what happened in the United States? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Except we support it.
All right. And Bobby Kennedy, who was at that meeting, said that meeting had a tremendous impact on JFK's whole foreign policy thinking from there on in. All right. And you can see that picture is them in the White House, because when Kennedy became elected, he brought Gullion in as kind of like his first ambassador to the Third World, okay? And as we'll see, Gullion becomes the point man on the great Congo crisis, all right? And I was kind of upset that not very many people have paid much attention to this, because it's actually the first big crisis that Kennedy addressed once he got into the White House, all right? And John, I haven't read this, but he told me that last night that he actually wrote 3 chapters about this in the second volume, and that's good, because I think the more attention that goes to the Congo, the better, all right? Because this thing extended throughout JFK's entire presidency, all right? All 3 years, all right? Why is it important? Because it shows Gullion's immense influence on Kennedy in his undying attempt to keep the Congo free of European influence and to keep that rich I should explain Katanga. Katanga is inside of Congo, regions, but it's extraordinary because there was more wealth inside of Katanga than there was in the entire rest of the country. And Congo's a huge country. Right, right. And so it would the British and the Belgians wanted to keep, they didn't care if Lumumba took the rest of the Congo. We want Katanga. So they manufactured a rebellion inside of Katanga, all right, which Lumumba was not going to stand for, all right?
There was a whole American committee to promote the liberation of Katanga.
Right, there was. William F. Buckley was part of it. Right, right, the liberation of Katanga. Okay. That's hysterical. All right. So, by the way, this is how I discovered Mahoney's book. I was on vacation in this little town called Julian, and going through this bookstore, and Lisa was with me, and she goes, "Look at this picture." All right. Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's worth about 1,000,000 words. Okay, this is Kennedy getting the news of Lumumba's death. All right, and the CIA had hid this from him for 3 weeks. All right, because Lumumba was actually killed before his inauguration. And this is, I think, February the 13th, about 3 weeks after. And Jacques Lou is the photographer here, and he's just getting some pictures of Kennedy, you know, walking around in his office, etc. And he said his kids were there, and it made me dragged out longer. And so he picks up the phone, and Stevenson tells him, "I just learned that Lumumba is dead." All right, and this is his reaction. Now, here's the question. Why would Kennedy react like that to the death of some socialist revolutionary in Africa? All right? I mean, we know that Eisenhower and Johnson would not have remotely acted like that. You know, how do we know this? Because Eisenhower and Dulles plotted the death of Lumumba. All right? And then after Kennedy is dead, LBJ reverses Kennedy's policy in Congo. And by the way, I have this from a very good source, a CIA pilot. He says, "Jim, you couldn't believe it. We went in, we took over the whole U.S. Embassy. All these Cuban guys from Operation 40 came in, and he started manning these pilots and tracking down the last of Lumumba's followers."
Tosh Plumley?
No, no. Peter, I would never use Tosh Plumley for anything, okay?
To be sure.
All right, good.
We all need to be here.
But
All
do
right.
you know this person's name, or is it?
He's passed away now.
Passed away?
Yeah. Yeah, right. All right. Okay, Patrice Lumumba, murdered by according to John, with a lot of help from the CIA, right?
Yeah, they made the whole thing possible. They tried to poison him, but the plan ended up getting them out of the compound on the loose, and they had their own helicopter. They were providing information on the chase, and so they wanted him dead.
Okay. Yeah, so kind of what I thought.
He was dismembered. He was reburied 3 times and cut into pieces, and eventually they put the pieces into acid to turn them into nothing.
Unbelievable.
Very
right.
brutal.
No relics.
All right, Dag Hammarskjöld, and by the way, I don't know if he, of course, was the Secretary General of the UN. All right, and he actually, Lumumba had turned everywhere, to the United States, to the Russians, to anybody to help him get the country back. And he wired Hammarskjöld. And Hammarskjöld is the only guy who decided we're going to help this guy. All right, the UN is supposed to be the voices of the weak against the strong, you know. And Lisa did a very nice article about the death of Hammarskjöld in the late 90s. But then a few years ago, a woman named Susan Williams did a whole book on the death of Hammarskjöld. All right, and that book was so powerful that it actually reopened a new investigation into, I'm not even saying he was killed, he was murdered. Okay, it's just a matter of how he was murdered. You know, was he murdered with a bomb on the plane, or was he shot down? Okay, but they got rid of him also. All right, and then of course,
But you don't know that's the CIA, though.
what?
Are you saying the CIA?
No. I'm saying if you, Dulles' name was mentioned, wasn't it, in one of the,
Operation Celeste document,
right,
which
it was mentioned. Okay, Dulles' name was specifically mentioned. All right, so all these 3 guys are dead, but there's a very interesting comment that almost nobody picked up, and I didn't even, it's in your article, isn't it? Wasn't this in your article? Yeah. Harry Truman says Dag Hammarskjöld was on the point of getting something done when they killed him. And then he says, notice, I said when they killed him.
When they
Okay? All right? And that's like in Susan Williams' book also. So why did Truman say that? Okay? And because it was later revealed to Greg Polgrain, the guy who wrote the book on Indonesia, that Hammarskjöld and Kennedy had made a secret alliance to keep both Congo and Indonesia out of the hands of imperial powers. George Ivan Smith, Hammarskjöld's first assistant, told Greg about this. All right, and so obviously what happened is that Kennedy told Truman, and that's how he uttered that. All right. Now let me flash a little bit forward, and this is why, because Truman said this. I believe this is why Dulles went to visit Truman in 1964 about his Washington Post editorial. Okay, because he thought, does everybody know that story? He wrote this unusual story about the CIA being out of control, and it was printed exactly 1 month after Kennedy's assassination. But it was started about 8 days after Kennedy. He started writing in his notes about 8 days after Kennedy. And Dulles makes this visit to Truman trying to get him to retract it. Okay, please, just tell him you made a mistake, etc. All right? And so this is why I think Dulles did that, because he was worried that Truman was going to make another one of these comments, this time in relation to the Kennedy assassination. Well, Kennedy went ahead. Kennedy had nothing but admiration for Dag Hammarskjöld. After he died, he said, Dag Hammarskjöld was the greatest statesman of the 20th century. Compared to him, I'm just a pygmy. All right? This assassination is very tragic in a lot of different senses, because Lumumba, of course, has become a hero. There's gold statues, there's stamps of him, there's all over Africa. They remember what he did, and as Jonathan Whitney wrote, not because he promoted socialism, which he did not, but because he resisted foreign intervention. He stood up to outsiders, if only by getting himself killed. So he became a martyr. That was actually a democratic election with a constitutional government. All right? And I don't have to say, Congo is a mess ever since. All right? Kennedy's policy was completely reversed. The CIA, as I said, that already mentioned that. The riches of Katanga did not go to the Congolese people as Kennedy wanted. They went to dictator Mobutu and his imperial employers. All right? Now, the same thing is going to happen in Indonesia. All right? This same pattern that we just saw in Congo. Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers approved a coup attempt to overthrow Sukarno. When Kennedy became president, he asked for this report. And guess what? It's not just us who get redacted documents. Dulles gave him a redacted version. Okay. Who do you think you are, the president or something? All right? But there was enough in it that Kennedy explained, no wonder this guy doesn't like us. We tried to overthrow his government. All right? So Kennedy was determined to make an alliance with Sukarno. And he assigned RFK and Ellsworth Bunker to negotiate the return of West Irian to Indonesia from the Netherlands.
It had never been part of Indonesia.
I can't hear
It
you.
had never been part of Indonesia. It was part of the Dutch Empire. It was
Right,
not part of
right.
Indonesia.
But part of the settlement after Indonesia became free, Sukarno wanted that included. Okay? But he didn't get it.
So
And-
did people who wanted to develop the market.
Right, we're going to talk about that.
And
All right.
I just
Now-
want to say West Irian is West Papua today.
Okay.
And they're still fighting this battle. Yeah.
Now, it's hard to believe, but this little island, West Irian, was even richer than Katanga. All right, it's probably, if you had a geologist survey of the entire world, it's probably the single richest area per square mile in the entire Earth. All right, and it's all kinds of stuff. There's gold, there's silver, there's copper, there's oil. All right, and that's why the Dutch didn't want to give it back. All right, so Kennedy does the same thing. All right, and he wants this to go to the people of Indonesia and Sukarno. Just one mine there, the Grasberg mine, does $3 billion a year in gold, silver, and copper. And multiply that by 40 years, you don't need to take your calculator, it's $120 billion, all right? That's the kind of wealth that was there, all right? And so that was what was at stake with Indonesia and this. And by the way, let me, I got to give some credit to a couple people here. Peter did he says it was printed in 1985. He did a very interesting essay about the whole coup that's going to come up in 1985.
It's coming out as a book later this
Oh, it
year.
is? Oh, terrific. I gave you a commercial.
Poetry and Terror.
Okay. All right.
Poetry and Terror?
Well, that's the working title. I think I'd like to call it Poetry, Terror, and Madness. We will see.
And then Lisa did a real, I believe, a milestone article about this in, I think, 1997, in which what she did is she actually related what happened in '65 to Kennedy's assassination. All right? And so the same pattern happens, you know, with LBJ reverses this policy with disastrous, well, not even, probably catastrophic would be better. Within 18 months of his assassination, the CIA plots to overthrow Sukarno and decimate the PKI, which was his communist base, all right, for his popularity. This takes place, and I have to, that number is probably ridiculously low. Okay, it's probably at least twice that. It's probably about 800,000 people were
The
killed.
British are now saying 3 million.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
3
They
million?
say between 500,000 and 3 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings to power Mr. Suharto, and Greg interviewed one of the guys who was let out of prison after Suharto abdicated. And it's always been a puzzle how they pulled this thing off, because the CIA wasn't talking, because they considered it their masterpiece of covert action. They didn't want anybody to know they were involved and tell anybody. What this guy said is that Suharto was part of the group that was supposed to take the dissident generals prisoner, not kill them, but take them prisoner, bring them to Sukarno and have Sukarno interrogate them. He said that got hijacked. Suharto had a partner in the cabal that was going to do this, and they ended up killing them, then mutilating their bodies and filming that, putting that on television, and saying that the communists had done this. And that's what began this jihad, okay, against the PKI. Oh, I should say one last thing. Suharto's deal was a 1090 deal. He would get 10%. The European powers in the United States will get 90. Before Kennedy was dead, before he died, he said, don't do anything like that. You should get 60-40. 60-40 for Indonesia, 40% for the imperial powers. And don't take any, and I'll help you. Take nothing less. All right, Kennedy continued and expanded the CIA program to arm the Tibetan rebels to fight against the Chinese. And by the way, do you know when this happens? We're going to talk about here the invasion of India by China. This is during the missile crisis. So Kennedy's actually managing both of these things during the missile crisis. You know, McCone's having a nervous breakdown over just the missile crisis, and he's actually doing both these things. So when Mao invades India in October of 1962, Kennedy began a daily airlift of arms and supplies to prevent China from overrunning India. 8 flights into Calcutta a day, 20 tons of arms and ammo. All right. See, Kennedy wanted India to be the democratic bulwark against China. All right. And that's why he had such a close relationship with Nehru. All right, it's a very interesting story. When Nehru came to visit Kennedy in his Oval Office, and he's lecturing him about all the terrible things that Great Britain had done to India during the colonization period, during the Raj. And Kennedy stands up, puts his hand out, says, stop. Nobody has to lecture me about what the British colonialism did. I come from a people who were dominated by the British for 800 years. And it was worse than what they did in India. All right? So that's one of the keys to why, why he was the way he was. All right? Okay, JFK gets England to go along with him on this program, and they both warned the Pakistanis and the leader Ayub Khan not to encourage or join Mao in his attack on Nehru in India.
Jim,
Yes.
you used the term earlier about China overrunning or
It was in the mountains.
My sense is that China never had any intent on.
No, I agree.
They were basically wanting to bloody India.
Right. I agree with that. That they weren't going to take over the country. It's the last thing they wanted to do. All right. But it was really, really one-sided until JFK began that airlift. Nehru was very grateful for him bringing in that
My
stuff.
guess is China would have just stopped.
Yeah.
And said, "We've proven our point."
All right. After JFK announces this, Mao decides to withdraw and offers a truce. All right. This policy of favoring India over Pakistan is reversed when JFK is killed. Both Johnson and Nixon will tilt towards Pakistan. With Nixon, it was utterly ridiculous how he tilted towards Pakistan afterwards. All right? I mean, Nixon and Kissinger really hated the Indians for whatever reason, but Kennedy really loved India. I think that's why he sent Galbraith as almost as one of his best friends there. All right? This will lead to two momentous events: the genocide in East Pakistan, commonly called Bangladesh, in 1971, which Nixon and Kissinger did not just ignore, but they actually helped by smuggling Khan these planes from Iran. All right? And again, this is one of those things that if I say 400,000 people died, other people are going to say, well, there's more than that. It's about 2 million. Nobody knows how many people died in this one. But I will say this. Henry Kissinger has to be the heavyweight champ of genocides in the post-World War II world, right? I mean, how many people had 3 of them? Okay, well, he did. This one, East Timor, and the worst of all, Cambodia. How is this guy walking around? The guy should be in prison.
Hillary kiss up.
And yet Hillary Clinton goes down and visits him for Christmas vacation. That's what can you learn from this guy?
You want a peace prize, though.
I know. All right. The use of Pakistan, of course, will become a base to battle the Soviets in Afghanistan, which leads to the rise of a guy named Osama bin Laden, which I don't have to talk about. All right. All right. Now, this brings us to what I believe is really, really interesting: Kennedy's Middle East policy, which many of us didn't even think he had a Middle East policy. And I wouldn't have known about it unless I read the Rakov book. All right? All right. And this was done, again, in rebellion against Dulles and Eisenhower, because Dulles and Eisenhower had favored Saudi Arabia, and they wanted to marginalize Nasser. All right? And they had done all this because Nasser would not join the Baghdad Pact. He said, I can't join the Baghdad Pact. I mean, everybody who looks up to me will look at me like I'm an American stooge, and I'm not going to do that. And so Dulles said, okay, then build the Aswan Dam with somebody else's money. And so he got the Russians to come in to build the Aswan Dam. All right? And so Kennedy thought that was really stupid. All right? And so his strategy was, we're going to freeze out Saudi Arabia and Iran. All right? Because they represent the monarchies and the fundamentalism. All right? And so we're going to go ahead and side with Nasser because he perceived Nasser as being secular and westernized, okay? And so with him, I'm going to go ahead and create this impression of fairness, all right, not favoring either side, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to negotiate with the Arab moderate states, and we're going to move towards a solution of the Palestine problem in my second term, okay? That was his overall strategy. And number 5 is very important because he was adamant there were not going to be any atomic weapons in the Middle East. All right, it's too much of a tinderbox. And by the way, if you talk to these guys, there's another book I'm going to show in a minute called Stealing the Atom, where he interviewed. He said, Look, the last guy who gave a damn about nuclear nonproliferation was JFK. All right? I mean, when Johnson heard that Israel had the bomb, Helms goes into his office and says, we now think, he goes, okay, fine. So Helms goes back, you didn't say anything. You know, okay. He was firmly opposed to the Shah of Iran and King Saud. And by the way, this was so extreme that when Nasser and the Saudis fought a war in Yemen, Kennedy favored Nasser in a war in Yemen. All right? And they were very dissatisfied with the Shah, all right, and they saw his monarchy being out of touch, all right, and opposed to civil rights. And by the way, the Shah of Iran did not come to Kennedy's funeral. All right? They went as far as commissioning a study in the State Department on the costs and liabilities of bringing back Mossadegh. All right? And so the Shah understood this, what he wanted him to do, and so he launches a reform movement in 1963, all right, called the White Revolution. All right? This pressure on the Shah was greatly lessened under Johnson, Nixon, and Carter. It kind of petered out, all right, because of these connections to big oil in the United States, and I think we know oil is kind of important in the Middle East. Okay, so LBJ was very close to Nelson Rockefeller. Kissinger was Nixon's national security advisor. And then, of course, you have Brzezinski, who has Carter in the Shah's palace as these riots are taking place outside, you know, like a year before he's overthrown. This is one of the stupidest things anybody's ever done. All right.
But wasn't Carter under a lot of pressure to let the Shah in the United States?
Oh, we're going to get to that, Gary.
Okay, all right.
We're going to get to that. All right? Okay, and so after JFK's death, the Shah felt close enough to the White House that he asked for some of these people, these dissidents in the United States, to be taken back. RFK interceded to halt the proceedings. All right? There you go, Gary. It was not Jimmy Carter's decision to let the Shah into the United States. That decision was pushed upon him by John McCloy. Second time his name has come up. What a great guy. Who was being paid royally to do so. This is in Kai Bird's book, The Chairman.
And I just say, not just McCloy, pushed on by Kissinger, who was
Right.
in the government, and pushed on by Brzezinski, as
Right.
was. They're all Rockefeller.
Right, exactly, exactly. All right? Now, I'm going to reveal what I believe is one of the greatest quotes in modern history. This quote goes down with Kissinger's. You know, I don't know why we have to stand by and watch Chile go communist just because those people voted for it. Okay, this one rivals that one.
It's
All right?
Carter's,
Now, so McCloy starts picking these guys off one by one. And so finally he corners Carter. All right? And before he caved in, he says,
Now we know who planned it.
what are you guys going to tell me to do when they invade the embassy and take our employees hostage? Okay?
That was what the advice they were getting.
All right, this move by Rockefeller and McCloy, which did so much to bring us Ronald Reagan, was previewed back in 1964 because David Rockefeller wanted to meet with JFK about planning an overthrow of the government of Brazil. Kennedy refused to take that meeting, but in December, Johnson did. The coup in Brazil began in the spring of 1964, and the point man on this was John McCloy. At the same time, he's sitting on the Warren Commission. All right? So he's involved with 3 reversals of Kennedy's foreign policy. All right? This had, of course, I don't have to say this, it's terrific results because Saudi Arabia becomes a secret sponsor to terrorism, and the explosion of Islamic religious fanaticism boils over in 1979. And I say that Kennedy made an absolutely incredible speech in the summer of 1957 on the floor of the Senate. And Jim Douglas thinks the American University speech is, I think this one is even better in certain ways. in which this is what he talked about Algeria. We should not be siding with France trying to put down this rebellion in Algeria. And there's a sentence in there where he says, if we do that, there's a danger of Muslim fundamentalism, of people escaping into that, okay? And we shouldn't be backing that kind of a movement. To say that in 1957, and then 22 years later to see how it happened, is really kind of remarkable, all right? Yeah, and Kennedy was firmly opposed to Israel having any nuclear weapons, and when he found out that the Israelis were lying to him about the Dimona reactor, he swore he would obstruct it with every means at his disposal. It wasn't because of favoring any side. He just didn't think anybody in the Middle East should have those things. All right? Okay, that policy is overturned by first Johnson and then Nixon. Nixon kind of had a deal with Golda Meir, is if you don't talk about them, we won't say anything about them. All right? All right? And this is a very good book on the subject, all right, Roger Mattson. And he revealed how Israel most likely stole the materials for their atomic bomb from a plant called Numec in Pittsburgh, PA. All right, this was completed, this reversal of JFK's Middle East policy is by the tilting towards Saudi Arabia and the overall kind of blatant favoring of Israel versus the Arabs in that area. So when the outburst of Islamic fundamentalism exploded, there really was no way to contain it. Now, these reversals were conscious by both LBJ and Nixon. And once RFK was assassinated, there was never any hope of bringing that kind of policy back. And then Jerry Ford, ironically, supplied the final coup de grace when he brings in Cheney and Rumsfeld. These guys were so crazy, they thought Kissinger and Nixon were too moderate. All right? Okay, especially towards the Soviets. Therefore, people like Wolfowitz and Nietzsche were brought in to do battle to steer the CIA to the right. I mean, when you're going to the right of the CIA, come on, that's like neo-Nazi stuff, okay? And so as a threat, and this was, I don't know, how many, are you familiar? Yeah, you're familiar with this? Okay, this whole Committee on the Present Danger, okay, that Cheney and Rumsfeld brought in to actually argue with the CIA. You're wrong. The Soviets have this terrible buildup. Okay, and he actually succeeded under Jerry Ford. All right, and he did it with, let's not forget, the CIA director at that time was George Bush, and thus began the neocon revolution and the rise of people like Dick Pearl. All right, they actually thought Haig was too moderate. I mean, all right, and so with this, JFK's foreign policy became a relic in the museum to talk about at hospitals in San Francisco. Decades later, all right, okay, because it ain't anywhere today, all right, and that's how we ended up with this. Thank you.